Thank you. Thank you both for the invitation and to everyone who's made the journey here today. It's wonderful to see you. We are living in an age of trauma. It might sound like a stark statement, but I do think it is a true one. So that's not to say that people are more traumatized now than they have ever been in history, but rather to say that an understanding of trauma and its impacts have become part of everyday life. It's language we use often. As a theologian, then, I'm interested in the impact trauma has on the ways in which we think about God and how we read the Bible. Whenever I say to people that my field of theology is working in the area of trauma, I often get one of two responses. First, well, of course, because the church has caused a lot of trauma, which is undoubtedly true. But often the second response is, well, I suppose that makes sense because of Jesus' death on the cross. And I'm not sure if that is true. And that's the question we want to explore today. There is an assumption by people that because Jesus dies in a grotesque and horrific manner on the cross, he must, therefore, be someone who has experienced trauma. And I think this assumption is aided by the splatter movie that is The Passion of the Christ, in which Mel Gibson took great delight in depicting the horrific brutality, violence, and bloodiness of the cross, an impulse celebrated at the time of the movie by many for its realism. Gibson has glorified the relative silence of the Gospels on the gruesomeness of the cross. And our collective memory, then, of the cross has certainly been coloured by the popularity of this film. Alongside this assumption about the particular experience of the cross, there is clear evidence that some people have taken great comfort in the idea that Jesus is one who has experienced trauma. For some people, to understand the cross and Jesus' experience as mirroring their own experiences has undoubtedly given great comfort and a sense of solidarity. So, for example, in her wonderful and powerful reflection on her own experience of assault, womanist scholar Chanel Smith positions Jesus as someone who has also experienced assault within the crucifixion. So she places Jesus as a not uncomplicated model for trauma survivors. Of course, the suffering experience of Jesus has been a great and consistent theme in Christianity, especially within the spiritual traditions. So we could turn, for example, to those mystics who seek to imitate Christ by becoming the crucified one and fusing their body with the body of Christ on the cross, an image of both disease and torment, as well as of marriage and sexual consummation. The 14th century English mystic Richard Roller writes, "Ah, Lord, your sorrow, why was it not my death?" Effective piety, the practice of emotionally charged devotion to Christ's humanity, also embodies this. A practice encouraged people to feel an emotional response to events like the crucifixion. So for medieval women, as the historian Caroline Walker Bynum argues, there was often a practice of understanding their own physical pains as an imitation of Christ's passion. All this is to say, I understand why people have been reasonably quick to assume that Jesus is someone who experiences trauma, even if the events of his death and resurrection make the precise question of surviving a tricky one. I've long found these ideas of Jesus as a trauma survivor complicated and not quite as natural a fit as these assumptions might suggest. So I'm going to outline some of the reasons why I don't think Jesus is a trauma survivor, at least from the perspective of the cross, before I go on to explore what might be some better ways of thinking about Jesus' relationship to trauma. But a good place to start is by defining what trauma is. Your mind might immediately go to medical diagnoses such as post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD whenever you think of trauma. And that is undoubtedly part of what I'm talking about. However, medicalized ways of talking about trauma are only partially helpful. I'm not a psychologist or a neurologist, but rather a theologian. So it makes more sense for me to use less medicalized ways of understanding trauma and focusing instead on more socio-cultural ways of thinking through it. And I do this not just because I'm not a healthcare professional, but also because most people around the world who have an experience of trauma will never get a medical diagnosis of PTSD or CPTSD, which is the complex form of trauma. If you think about all the places around the world where traumatic experiences might be taking place and the access in those places to healthcare and diagnoses of mental illnesses, most people are unlikely to never get that. But furthermore, the ways in which trauma is codified in medical literature is largely based on the American Psychological Association's Diagnostic Manual. It is a book I do not recommend you pick up, it's very dull. But it's also not a neutral text. It is significantly shaped, this book of medical diagnoses is significantly shaped by the Veterans Association's interests alongside the interests of the healthcare insurance industry in the USA. The VA, the Veterans Association, is a branch of US government responsible for providing lifelong healthcare services to eligible military veterans. So, with these financial concerns in mind, it's not hard to spot potential bias in the ways in which these are shaped for diagnosis. Trauma resists easy definition. Every year I teach a class on trauma and theology to my students and tell them that in no way should they aim to come out of the class with a steady definition of trauma. That's not the aim. In fact, being a little bit more confused about it is usually a good aim. It's often connected with things like power and powerlessness, such that those without power in particular situations are more vulnerable to trauma, a trauma that perhaps overwhelms ordinary coping systems. It can also be associated with an experience of rupturing within the individual, and this can manifest as a shattered sense of identity, an inability to speak about what has happened to them, hallucinations, nightmares, flashbacks. Trauma is a profoundly embodied thing. By this I mean it is not a disease of some kind of abstract mind, but something that manifests itself very clearly in the body, including in things like chronic illnesses and autoimmune diseases. In his book, The Body Keeps the Score, Bessel van der Kolk makes it clear that no amount of talking therapies alone can cure trauma. Van der Kolk says this: we, that's him and the team of people that he's been working with for 30 years or so with American veterans, so again, a very particular kind of way of thinking, he says, we have discovered that helping victims of trauma find the words to describe what has happened to them is profoundly meaningful, but usually it is not enough. The act of telling the story does not necessarily alter the automatic physical and hormonal responses of bodies that remain hypervigilant, prepared to be assaulted or violated at any time. For real change to take place, the body needs to learn that the danger has passed and to live in the reality of the present. So trauma resists simple definitions, but I think reflecting on senses of powerlessness, overwhelm, rupture, and the body can begin to help paint a picture of what we're talking about today. Trauma is what remains in the body after an experience has passed. So I've been working in trauma for nearly 15 years, and throughout my work, I have made a number of arguments about why I'm not entirely sure that Jesus is a trauma survivor. And I've usually done that in the context of focusing on a slightly different question, so that this question of Jesus and trauma has been something of a side quest. And I'm drawing various different ideas together here to present them to you, and hoping that this is the beginning of a larger project with some colleagues of mine at Cambridge. So firstly, I want to acknowledge that with or without Gibson's gore fest in our imagination, the cross is certainly a horrific thing for anyone to experience. But the awfulness of a particular event is not how we determine if someone is traumatized or not. It's important to note that the specifics of a particular event are not actually important. No event in and of itself is traumatic, no matter how dangerous or terrifying it might be. Rather, it is about how an event is experienced by a person that produces trauma. So that means that two people can go through exactly the same experience, and only one of them experience trauma as a result of it. So we cannot, therefore, presume to identify trauma primarily on the experience of an event that we expect to be traumatic. But on the flip side, nor can we discount trauma because it would seem to stem from something that we do not usually recognize as traumatic, or we wouldn't personally find to be traumatic. Therefore, we cannot assume that Jesus is traumatized by the cross. Rather, we have to look for some evidence after the fact that this experience had produced a traumatic effect on Jesus. This post-event consideration of the impact of trauma is complicated, of course, by the simple fact that Jesus does not survive the cross. He dies as a result of the experience and is, of course, resurrected 3 days later. This resurrected body of Jesus still bears the physical scars from wounds he received during his lifetime, but in other ways, this body is perfected. Sometimes people who are interested in trauma make a lot about the fact that Jesus' resurrected body continues to bear the scars of the crucifixion. I agree that these scars are incredibly significant in terms of how we think about what our bodies might be like in the eschaton, but I'm not sure it tells us anything in particular about Jesus as someone who might have encountered trauma. The word trauma comes from the Greek word for wound, and it can be really helpful when talking about trauma to think of the experience as something that has caused a wound. There's been work undertaken around the concept of moral injury, which is a different category to trauma, but bears some things in common. But this etymological connection between trauma and wound sometimes gets overblown. So some might argue that because Jesus still bears the wounds in his resurrection body, and wound indicates trauma, therefore he must be a trauma survivor. But I don't think the etymological connection is sufficient to make such a claim. So to determine whether Jesus has experienced trauma, and in the absence of access to a physical Jesus we can observe and interrogate, we have to turn our attention to the Gospels and the other New Testament texts themselves, particularly the post-resurrection experiences. And we can employ then literary techniques in trauma studies in the reading of these texts to see if there's any evidence of trauma sitting in or underneath these narratives. There's been a lot of interest in using trauma-informed ways of reading the biblical text over the last decade or so. There are a couple of really good books. I'm just going to plug them here now. They're not ones I've written. One is by David Carr called Holy Resilience, The Bible's Traumatic Origins, which goes through the whole Bible, but it's quite a small book. And the other one is by Bowes and Frechette called Bible Through the Lens of Trauma, which is a collection of essays. However, almost all of this trauma-informed attention has been paid to the Hebrew Bible, to the Old Testament. So, for example, books of the Bible like Psalms and Lamentations or the story of the Exodus have been read through the lens of trauma. And this has proved really insightful for how we understand the texts themselves, and perhaps something about the people who wrote them and the communities for which they were written. However, almost no work of this nature has been attempted with the New Testament. A couple of trauma theologians have paid attention to the post-resurrection narratives in the Gospels, but not with a focus on Jesus. In both of these examples, the examples I'm talking about are single chapters of work in a larger book. So, in Trauma and Grace, Serene Jones explores the short ending of the Gospel of Mark as an evidence of trauma. You might be familiar with the fact that the original version of Mark's Gospel ends without a resurrection appearance. In this ending, the women who come to the tomb encounter a young man dressed in white who tells them that Jesus is not here, he is risen, and they should go and tell the disciples. Full stop. That's it. The longer ending, in which Jesus appears to Mary Magdalene and the other disciples, is a later addition to the text. So Serene Jones reads this not as evidence of Jesus experiencing trauma, but as indicative of the trauma of the early church in which the gospel was produced, who are still trying to make sense of what's happened after the death and resurrection of Jesus. So there is trauma, but it's not Jesus's. Similarly, in her book Spirit and Trauma, Shelley Rambo explores Jesus' appearance to Mary Magdalene and the beloved disciple in John's Gospel. Rambo writes this: "In the aftermath of overwhelming violence and suffering, accurate accounts of the events are not fully accessible or recoverable. The truth of the events cannot be communicated directly. Mary and the beloved disciple witness the death of Jesus in this way. The struggle to locate and identify his body and the difficulties of translation and communication are enacted in their accounts. Both, as well, experience delays in their witness." Again, this analysis of a gospel text is focused on a trauma experience, but it's the experience of Mary Magdalene and the beloved disciple, not the experience of Jesus. So whilst these analyses are helpful and insightful, they're not actually giving us any indication that we can consider Jesus as someone who experienced trauma. We can ask a few questions about Jesus' behaviour in the post-resurrection appearances to try and determine if Jesus is exhibiting any signs of trauma. So, in the aftermath of a supposed trauma experience, does Jesus experience his body as one that is vulnerable and unsafe? Does Jesus experience any failure to be able to put his experiences into language or to understand what has happened to him? Does Jesus experience nightmares, hallucinations, and flashbacks that are so common in that experience of a rupture in time? Even a cursory read of the gospel narratives would seem to suggest that we cannot say that Jesus appears to exhibit any of these trauma-induced characteristics. He does not present as one who has suffered trauma. When literary theorists are working with trauma-informed readings, they look for some symptoms of trauma in the text. So, for example, we might expect to see a lot of use of metaphor and simile in trauma texts. That's because the experience of trauma often remains just out of reach of our cognition. So approximate forms of language have to be used. We might also expect to see gaps, absences, and repetitions, again, because the memory of trauma can be inaccessible and elusive. Intertextual echoes are also common in trauma narratives, where there are frequent returns to older texts woven into the narrative. These are all quite established ways of engaging with trauma within the text, and a lot of this work comes out of the work that was done in the 50s, 60s, and 70s with Holocaust survivors who were some were writing about their experience and engaging with both psychiatry and psychology as ways of kind of establishing how to do this work, what we might expect to see in texts that exhibit trauma. So you might perhaps argue that John's Gospel is replete with metaphor and intertextual echoes. But this probably says more about the community who wrote the Gospel than it does about Jesus. And this itself points to a particular problem. None of the Gospel accounts, nor the book of Acts, which of course also contains post-resurrection appearances, are first-hand eyewitness accounts. None are texts written by Jesus. All are written by and for later communities whose recollection and presentation of the narrative of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection are shaped by agendas both political and theological. Suffice to say, I think I can argue that I've got some pretty good reasons for resisting the idea that Jesus is someone who's experienced trauma. We can't assume that an event, even one as horrific as the crucifixion, is traumatic. Experiences are traumatic, not events. Jesus' resurrection body does bear scars, but we can't automatically connect those with the experience of trauma. And finally, I don't think we see any evidence in the texts available to us that Jesus has had this kind of experience. Why does it matter? I think it matters a lot. In a pastoral sense, I have some anxiety about making a claim that Jesus is a trauma survivor because of what the implications might be. I'm anxious that such a claim might offer a false sense of hope, or even a troublesome sense of identification. Turning first to this idea of a false sense of hope, we have to begin by noting that hope can be quite a contentious term within fields of trauma theology. For some theologians, the whole work of trauma theology rests on a concept of hope, whether that is hope that God will guide the trauma survivor back into wholeness, or hope in eschatological promises of no more tears, sadness, weeping, or pain. My concern regarding this category of hope with relation to the identification of Jesus as a trauma survivor is connected to the swiftness of the resurrection. In the aftermath of trauma, a person who has experienced trauma might engage in the task of post-traumatic remaking of the self. It's a bit of a mouthful, but it's language that I prefer to use rather than language like recovery or healing. Recovery has a very backwards-looking sense to it, and trauma survivors will say that there is no going back to who they were before the experience. And the word healing is, for me, too couched in some very unhelpful forms of Christian theology. So I use the language post-traumatic remaking. This task of remaking has a number of stages. They're not linear, but the English language works in a linear way, so I'm going to have to give them to you linearly. But they are messy and iterative. They include then establishing a sense of physical, emotional, and spiritual safety, constructing a narrative of trauma that is witnessed and believed, paying attention to the body and the way in which the body has been impacted by trauma, and then reconnecting with communities that enable you to flourish. In terms of the resurrection, this remaking, if indeed that is what it is, comes very quickly for Jesus. If we do name Jesus as someone who's experienced trauma, but then we're not able to identify any post-resurrection sites of remaking, then where does the laborious and ongoing work of this remaking happen except in the resurrection? I've already said we see no evidence of Jesus struggling with the impacts of trauma in the post-resurrection narratives. So we might assume that his resurrected body is one that is remade. Of course, theologically speaking, Jesus' resurrected body is the promise of wholeness and peace for all traumatized bodies, and something that can be hoped for with anticipation. But my concern is that if we name Jesus as a trauma survivor, It sets up some pretty unrealistic expectations for trauma survivors themselves. Many trauma survivors will experience at least some impacts of their experience of trauma throughout their entire lifetime. The task of post-traumatic remaking isn't a simple tick list to move through until it's finished, but rather is a collection of tasks a person might need to engage in for the rest of their lives. My concern is that pointing to Jesus as a trauma survivor and thus making him into some kind of role model for all trauma survivors sets up some unrealistic expectations about what life following trauma looks like, both for the individual, but also for the church communities that surround them. It's not difficult to further imagine that by presenting Jesus as one who also experiences trauma to the church, one might in fact be encouraging a form of solidarity that promotes no motivation or impetus for change. After all, if we are to imitate Christ, and Christ experiences trauma, then this is not necessarily something we should be actively seeking to challenge and fight against. But even if we do recognise trauma as something we should be actively pursuing in justice, if Jesus is a trauma survivor par exemple, then what does it mean to imitate Christ post-trauma? This becomes especially troublesome when we remind ourselves, once again, that Jesus doesn't exhibit any signs of trauma. Is that what we expect of trauma survivors in the church? So, I felt pretty confident about saying that there are some very good reasons as to why it's quite logical to think that Jesus is not a trauma survivor. And indeed, I gave a version of this paper about 2 years ago and found the conversation afterwards incredibly helpful because it provoked me to think a bit more widely. So I've continued to think about this and engage in discussion with colleagues and with students, and I've become less certain, which, given the slippery nature of trauma itself, is perhaps quite right. I've begun to wonder if I've been too myopic in my focus. Have I wondered, been too focused on the cross as a site of trauma for Jesus? I find this pretty ironic, given that I've spent much of my theological work and teaching reminding people that there is more to Jesus than just his death on the cross. That if we want to understand what something like the Eucharist, for example, is all about, then we must look to more than just the cross. We must look to the whole of Jesus' life. That was my entire PhD in a sentence there. Is a broader approach, then, than just the cross? Is a broader approach to thinking about Jesus' relationship with trauma, not just in terms of his experience of the cross, then, able to offer us some further insight into this question. Does Jesus experience trauma? Well, it depends where you start from. I think you have a hard time arguing it if you only start from the cross, but maybe you have a better time arguing for it if you start earlier on in Jesus' life. For example, we could start with the fact that Jesus is born into a lineage of historical trauma in his Jewishness. I mentioned earlier the ways in which biblical scholars have identified trauma in the Hebrew Bible. The experience of both exodus and exile for the Jewish people is one that has been claimed as a cultural form of trauma. And there's increasing work in this area. David Carr's book, Holy Resilience, charts the ways in which these trauma responses become encoded within the Hebrew Bible, and then significant in terms of the framing of Jewish identity by the time Jesus was born. This social sense of trauma can become so tightly entwined with identity that it is just inherited as part of one's sense of belonging to a particular community. In addition to these socio and cultural experiences of trauma, we could turn our attention to the biological sphere. Recent work in epigenetics indicates that there's a biological blueprint passed down from parent to child. And we know that about 98% of DNA is related to emotions, behaviour, and personality traits. So studies of the Dutch famine and the Chinese Great Famine and communities descended from the transatlantic slave trade and from the Holocaust indicate biological responses to trauma, including blood sugar levels, hypertension, cortisol levels, occurring in generations, many years removed from the actual experience of the famine or the transatlantic slave trade or the Holocaust. Trauma can be passed into ova and sperm, impacting many subsequent generations. So perhaps it's no stretch of the imagination to reflect on Mary's experience as one forced to undergo an arduous and uncertain journey late in her pregnancy as a refugee, as well as her experience of becoming pregnant before marriage, as perhaps creating certain stresses within her body that are potentially passed on to the fetus Jesus. If this were true, then Jesus might be born with a predisposition to experience some of the aforementioned events traumatically, perhaps impacting his capacity for resilience. Similarly, Jesus might inherit biological markers of trauma response from his mother, visible in his blood, his hormones, and his brain. Jesus is born into an oppressed people group, born into poverty, forcibly displaced. He's a migrant. He suffers bereavements. You might think here of his father Joseph, his friend Lazarus, and probably many others along the way. And he is persecuted. All of these are events that we know people sometimes experience as traumatic. But, as I said right at the start of this paper, just because there are events that people sometimes experience as traumatic does not make them traumatic events per se. We cannot assume that Jesus is traumatized just because of these facts. But this discussion does point to a need for a broader perspective on Jesus' relationship to trauma, much broader than simply by looking at the cross. Contemporary developments in understanding trauma, not just in a text, but across a community and within a biological line, add further dimensions to an already very complex picture of what it means to experience trauma and how we might engage responsibly with such experiences. So, does Jesus experience trauma? Well, I suppose the answer is maybe. There are, I think, very good reasons for not wanting to jump to conclusions and assume that simply because Jesus experiences the horror of the cross, that must be a traumatizing event, and therefore he is someone who has experienced trauma. Events, of course, not in and of themselves traumatic. The only evidence we have available to us to make any kinds of judgments about Jesus and trauma are the Gospels and parts of the rest of the New Testament. Initial readings of these texts do demonstrate the presence of trauma for some characters and communities within them, but not necessarily for the person of Jesus. Given that, as I said, most biblical work on trauma so far has focused on the Hebrew Bible, much more of this kind of work is needed in the area of New Testament studies, if only we knew a New Testament expert. Regardless of the specifics of Jesus' life and death, it is clear that Jesus' experience of suffering, pain and betrayal in his death have long been a source of great comfort to Christians in times of need. So, for example, the 14th century English mystic Julian of Norwich takes great comfort in her visions of Christ upon the cross. It is in response to such a vision that she receives the image of a hazelnut, in which she realizes that God made it, God loves it, and therefore God keeps it. The passion of Christ becomes for Julian a testimony of God's love, one that brings her great comfort. From a pastoral sense, there may be great value for individuals in recognizing Christ as one who has experienced things that are like what you are going through. Indeed, I have no interest in gatekeeping motifs and images that might be very meaningful to people. From an academic sense, the answer to the question of whether Jesus is a trauma survivor or a person who's experienced trauma is still up in the air. Thank you. Oh, that's a really good question. I think I don't think it matters too much to me because I'm very conscious that we'll never know. What worries me is the ways in which people use the image of Jesus as someone who's experienced trauma as a kind of spiritual bypassing, or as a way of minimizing what people are going through, or as really unhelpful ways of offering guidance to people. So in one sense, we'll never know, and maybe it doesn't matter. But in the thing that does matter to me is how people use that image, because I think pastorally it can be really helpful, but it can also be really unhelpful, and we need to be very careful then about how we use it. So if I can simply raise a bit of a question that might make people pause a little bit to think about that, then I'm happy. You can go either way, fine, we don't know. I'm happy in the middle. I think there's so much, I went through the kind of various different ways in which we might, or different experiences that Jesus did have that might have been, there's so much there, who knows? But it's the kind of pastoral use of it that I have encountered being very unhelpful with some trauma survivors. So. That's such a good question and a really interesting definition. When I did my doctoral work, I used the image of an earthquake so if you imagine your theology as a landscape, and then trauma happens and it rolls through that like an earthquake, and some things might stand, but a lot of things will fall. The ground won't look the same. Some things will be torn open. And so I've found that kind of, like radical realization that the world is not as you thought. That really resonates. Jesus would have been well aware crucifixions would have happened frequently. There's an interesting question about the extent to which Jesus knows that that's what's going to happen to him. Of course, you could turn to something like the Garden of Gethsemane as perhaps a more traumatic experience. Jesus physically sweats blood in that, which there's loads of really interesting kind of medical research on the kind of ways in which what has to happen in the body for that to happen. Maybe that's something actually by the time he gets to the cross, although it's horrible and painful, it is as it is expected to be. And it's something he has at that point resigned himself to, or given himself fully to is probably a better word for it. We easily reach for the cross, and I'm not sure it's helpful. I'm not sure it's super helpful for us. Yeah, thank you. It's a really good question. Oh, that's really interesting. So the effective piety is, I think of effective piety in some cases so we're talking particularly about kind of mid to late medieval movement within Christianity, where emotional responses become very significant parts of how Christians are encountering God, Jesus, in different ways across Europe. Effective piety I find really fascinating, because I wonder if it connects into a form of hyperarousal, which is very common in people who experience trauma, where their bodies are kind of on high alert, and their ability to appropriately regulate emotional responses can often be distorted. So I wonder if there's some kind of connection there. I don't want to say that all the mystics in the medieval period were trauma survivors. I've really struggled with the idea of like diagnosing people back with things that, medical conditions that didn't exist in the 14th century, but do exist now. But rupture and rapture, I guess in both senses, there is a breaking open. Rapture, a kind of breaking open of the divine, but rupture, I think, probably more of a breaking open of the human. Whether you have to have both, I'm not sure. That's a really good question. I'll have to think some more. But I like rupture or rapture, and I may write a book with that title. So. Maybe, yeah. I probably wouldn't say that. It is a long event if you are going to kind of connect it with kind of more contemporary ways of thinking about trauma, you might lean into something more like complex PTSD, where there's a series of things that have happened rather than a kind of single one-off event. You might be able to kind of think of how different people's experiences might fit into those two things. So perhaps it might bear more in common with CPTSD, especially if you want to take into account all the other things that I've talked about. I think the moment of Jesus's quoting from the Psalms is interesting, but a sense of abandonment doesn't necessarily indicate any of the kind of trauma symptoms that we've talked about here, that we've talked about today. So I don't think it's a bad thing to think about that as a kind of really pinnacle moment and something that's really powerful. But as a uniquely emphasized experience of trauma, I don't think I see any evidence to suggest that that's the case. Jesus is as human as we are. He's also fully divine in a sense that we are not. But if you want to think about the Annunciation incarnation event when Mary becomes pregnant, the wholeness, the whole thing that makes Jesus human is received from his mother. There's no human father that contributes any DNA or sperm or anything like that. So that means that everything Jesus is as a human comes out of Mary's DNA. Now, if you wanted to get super technical about that, it really should mean that Jesus is a woman, but you'll be relieved to hear I'm not going to argue that because I don't think it's true. But Mary is not an oven in which a fully formed bun Jesus is put. Mary contributes her own DNA into Jesus. Otherwise, Jesus is not as human as we are, and it's important that he is as fully human and fully divine. And he experiences all the things that we experience, even temptation. He experiences all the things that we do. So I do think it's important that we understand the humanity. This also is my PhD project, that we understand the humanity of Jesus as coming completely from the Jewish matrilineal line of Mary. Does Jesus know what's going to happen to him? Yeah, I think he does. And I think that's another reason why I wouldn't necessarily point to the cross as a place of trauma. It's not... or certainly in that kind of classic sense of the kind of trauma experience that kind of comes out of nowhere. Jesus knows what's going to happen to him. Who knows what the mind of Christ is like, how much of that detail is known, but I certainly think that the destination is known. This is really interesting. So when I very first started thinking about Jesus in relation to trauma, I remember having a conversation with some colleagues at one of the universities, and I said, I'm just not sure you can be traumatized by something you volunteered for. And I said it and I thought, actually, that's not right. I don't think that's true at all, because of course we have members of the armed forces who, are not conscripted and they willingly volunteer and can still come out of things having experienced trauma. So I'm not sure knowing and accepting can be a kind of definitive yes or no. It's important that we think about trauma as a somatic thing rather than a semantic thing. So it doesn't, like, you might think, okay, I've joined the army, I'm going out to be deployed in this particular place, and I kind of broadly know what I'm in for. I've read the things, I've talked to the people, I've had all the briefings. That's the semantic bit of the brain, the word bit. The somatic bit is the body, and you can't reason with it. So I think knowledge of what will happen is very helpful in preparing you, perhaps giving you resources, resilience. I hate the word resilience, but it's probably the quite right here. But it doesn't necessarily protect the body from what might happen. I think that's the best I can do with that one. It's a good question. Yes, there's a massive danger in conflating suffering and trauma, and the two are absolutely not the same thing. Suffering is a normal part of human life. It's sad, but we go through it. Broadly speaking, most of us have enough support networks either within ourselves or around us to get through it. It's very normal. Trauma is an embodied response where if you took a person who's experienced trauma and scanned their brain would literally light up in ways that are different to somebody who hasn't experienced trauma. So there's something very physical going on that's making a real difference here. And it means then that you cannot just do the talking therapies that you might find helpful in a kind of depressive episode, perhaps, or normal experience of suffering like grief. You have to do the body part as well. So I think there's a massive problem, not least because it devalues the significance and impact of what trauma is and needs to be taken really seriously. Can't just be handled in the same way that suffering is. So suffering eventually we can integrate into ourselves for good or for worse, but we can kind of get through it. Trauma, because it's in that somatic part, not the semantic part, it resists that integration, and that's why the body therapies, liturgies of the flesh, I sometimes call them, are so important. It's one of the reasons why lots of trauma survivors have tattoos, actually, find that way of engaging with the body in lots of different ways is a really important part. That's a really great question. If you come away with nothing else today, suffering and trauma are not the same thing. Thank you. I would recommend you go and buy a book called Trauma-Informed Spiritual Care by Danielle Tominio Hansen, Hansen, Hansen. In that, she goes through, it's a very small book. There's 4 stages of how to offer trauma-informed spiritual and pastoral care in a church context. It's written for chaplains, but I think would work really well in the kind of local parish church as well. She talks about safety, story, reconnection and justice. They're the 4 kind of attributes of this way of caring for people. But what I would say is anyone who's involved in pastoral care should read some good stuff on trauma. Danielle's book's good. Small plug, my own book's quite good. You could read Bessa van der Kolk's The Body Keeps the Score. It's not without its problems, but it's a good kind of account of trauma. Gabor Mate's stuff is very good. Just to be even a little bit trauma-informed. You should advocate for trauma-informed pastoral care training. Plenty of people around who will do that. But the most important thing, I think, to remember if you're engaging in pastoral care with people who've experienced trauma is that you are not able to talk them round. There's nothing rational going on there. But also that their story will change because they have very limited and very, whatever this is, access to the memory of what's happened to them. And that doesn't mean they're lying. And so believing people, making sure they're safe, and making sure that you are attending to the body would be like, if you do nothing else, do those things and buy Danielle's book.